Lucas Reyes walked out of the large, echoing auditorium with a sense of purpose. The applause from his recent speech still lingered in his mind, a speech that called for transparency in law enforcement and the urgent need to address systemic corruption. He had spoken about integrity, the power of accountability, and the critical importance of building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Lucas was well aware that his presence as a high-ranking black FBI agent added weight to his words. He was a symbol of what the system could look like if genuine reform took root. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows over the streets as Lucas made his way to the park. It was a brief reprieve from the intensity of the conference, a moment to clear his mind before a critical meeting. He had received a tip from a confidential informant about a significant case, one that promised to expose corruption at the highest levels of the local political sphere. As an FBI agent who had made a career out of taking down corrupt officials, Lucas knew this meeting could be crucial. He chose a less frequented park in the heart of the city for the rendezvous. It was known for its quiet paths lined with towering oaks and dense shrubbery, a stark contrast to the bustling downtown only a few blocks away. But as he approached the entrance, he noticed how the weather had shifted. Dark, thick clouds began to roll in from the horizon, slowly swallowing the fading daylight. A brisk wind whipped through the trees, carrying the scent of rain. The park, normally a haven of calm, felt strangely foreboding. Lucas scanned the surroundings, alert as always, his instincts honed from years on the job. He made his way down the gravel path, his footsteps muffled by the layer of damp leaves scattered across the ground. Every shadow seemed to stretch and distort as the dimming light gave way to a growing sense of isolation. He checked his watch. He was a few minutes early, but he didn't want to leave anything to chance. The informant had insisted on secrecy, and Lucas knew better than to ignore such requests. Then he saw them, two figures moving toward him from the opposite end of the path. At first, Lucas thought it might be the informant arriving ahead of schedule. But as the two figures came closer, the gleam of silver badges and the navy blue of their uniforms became unmistakable. Two local police officers, their expressions guarded and watchful, closed in on him with purposeful strides. Lucas's instincts, fine-tuned over decades in law enforcement, told him that something was off. He had no reason to be concerned, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was about to escalate. "ID, please," said the first officer, his voice clipped and formal. It was Derek Mulligan, a bulky man in his late 30s with a square jaw and narrowed eyes that seemed to be searching Lucas for a reason to escalate the interaction. Beside him stood Kyle Baxter, a younger officer, leaner, but with a nervous energy that radiated through his stance. They looked out of place in the park at this hour, and the absence of any pleasantries set Lucas on edge. "Excuse me?" Lucas's tone was calm but firm. He was well aware of his rights, and there was no legal basis for them to demand identification. "May I ask why you're stopping me?" Mulligan's gaze hardened, and he stepped closer, his chest puffing out in a gesture of authority. "Just a routine check. We need to see some ID," he insisted, his tone laced with an unspoken threat. Lucas kept his posture relaxed, but his mind was already racing. He had dealt with situations like this before. Subtle power plays meant to unsettle him, to provoke a reaction. He had learned the hard way that any sign of resistance could be misinterpreted, especially in situations like this. But he wasn't about to comply without understanding their motives. "With all due respect, officer," Lucas said, keeping his voice steady, "I don't believe you have any reason to ask me for my ID. Unless you have a specific cause or suspicion, I'm not obliged to provide it." Mulligan's eyes flickered with irritation, and he exchanged a quick glance with Baxter, who shifted uncomfortably. The younger officer's hand hovered near his belt, a clear sign that he was on edge. Lucas's heart rate increased, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't about him personally. It was about the uniform he wore, the color of his skin, and the authority he represented. He felt the chill of the wind intensify as the first raindrops began to fall, tapping lightly against the leaves overhead. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, as the officers stood their ground. Mulligan's voice took on a harsher edge. I'm not going to ask you again. Show us some ID, or we're going to have a problem here. Lucas met Mulligan's stare without flinching. He knew this wasn't just a routine stop. This was something else, something uglier, simmering just beneath the surface. The stormy clouds overhead mirrored the tension building between them. He had to tread carefully, knowing that his next words could determine the course of the entire encounter. I'm here on official business, Lucas stated clearly, making sure his voice carried authority without sounding confrontational. I have an appointment. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I won't be providing ID without a legitimate reason. Baxter's fingers twitched, and he took a small step back, as if unsure of how to proceed. Mulligan, however, seemed unfazed, his jaw setting in a stubborn line. This is my last warning, he said, his tone dripping with barely concealed hostility. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to take this further. A flicker of movement caught Lucas's attention from the corner of his eye. A passerby who had slowed down, observing the scene with a curious expression. He knew that if this escalated, there would be witnesses, and that could either be his saving grace or complicate matters even further. He felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on his shoulders, aware that he was caught in a delicate balance between asserting his rights and avoiding a confrontation that could spiral out of control. Mulligan's stance was rigid, a silent challenge, while Baxter looked more uncertain, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The tension was palpable, a physical force that seemed to push against Lucas's calm demeanor. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This felt like a test, not just of his professionalism, but of his identity, his dignity, and his determination to stand up for what he believed in. Lucas took a slow, measured breath, feeling the rain grow steadier around them. He had no intention of backing down, but he also knew that pushing the confrontation any further would be risky. Every decision in the next few minutes would matter, not just for him, but for the informant he was supposed to meet, and for everything he stood for as a black man in a position of power in law enforcement. It was a moment that demanded both strength and restraint, and he was determined not to let it slip through his fingers. The standoff between Lucas and Officers Mulligan and Baxter intensified as the air grew colder with the approaching rainstorm. The overcast sky cast long, ominous shadows across the park, matching the unease that was building around them. Lucas felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, aware that his every move was being scrutinized by the officers who seemed eager to escalate the situation. He had faced similar encounters in his career, but there was something more dangerous and personal about this confrontation. Something that felt like a challenge to his very identity. Mulligan's stance grew more rigid, his hand hovering near his holster. "Why are you in this park?" he demanded, his voice low and aggressive. "This area isn't exactly friendly territory for people like you." Lucas's eyes narrowed. He knew exactly what Mulligan meant, and he chose his words carefully. "I have a right to be here," he said firmly, keeping his tone level. "And unless you have a legitimate reason to detain me, I suggest you step back." Baxter shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. His eyes darted between Mulligan and Lucas sensed a hint of hesitation in the younger officer's posture. It was a crack in their facade, and he knew he needed to exploit it without pushing them too far. Rain began to patter against the leaves above, creating a steady rhythm that matched the rising tension. Lucas felt the first drops land on his face, cool and sharp. The sky was darkening rapidly, and he knew they were running out of time before the storm hit in full force. But he couldn't afford to back down. He needed to stand his ground and show the officers that he wouldn't be intimidated. "This is your last chance," Mulligan warned, his tone heavy with threat. "Show us some ID, or we'll take you in for resisting a lawful order." Lucas's pulse quickened, but he kept his face impassive. He could see a small crowd beginning to gather at a distance. Curious onlookers who had been drawn by the confrontation. Some were tourists, but others were locals, people who were familiar with the kind of harassment that often took place in this part of town. A few had already pulled out their phones, recording the encounter from a distance. Lucas weighed his options quickly, aware that the situation could explode at any moment. He needed to de-escalate without losing control. "I'm asking again," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What is the reason for this stop? I have not committed any crime. and you have no legal grounds to detain me." Mulligan's eyes flashed with anger. "We don't need a reason to stop someone who looks suspicious," he shot back, his words sharp and filled with insinuation. "And right now, you look very suspicious to me." Lucas felt the sting of the officer's words, the barely veiled racism cutting through the air like a knife. He was used to such tactics, thinly veiled insults meant to provoke a reaction, but he refused to let Mulligan get under his skin. He took a deep breath, calming himself even as the rain began to fall harder. "That's not how the law works," Lucas replied evenly, refusing to be baited. "You need reasonable suspicion to stop someone. Now, if you can't provide that, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." The tension between them was electric, charged with a mix of defiance and authority. Lucas's training as an FBI agent had taught him to remain composed in high-stakes situations, and he used every ounce of that training now. He knew that any sudden movement could be seen as aggression, and he kept his hands visible, palms open at his sides. A deliberate gesture of non-threatening confidence. The gathering crowd grew larger, whispers of discontent rippling through the onlookers. Some voiced their support for Lucas, their voices low but firm, while others watched with anxious curiosity, unsure of how the encounter would end. The presence of witnesses seemed to unnerve Baxter, who glanced nervously over his shoulder at the people recording the scene. Mulligan, however, seemed determined to push the situation to its breaking point. "All right," Mulligan said suddenly, his tone cold and authoritative. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest." Lucas's heart sank, but he didn't allow his expression to betray his thoughts. He had expected this, expected that the officers would try to assert their dominance through intimidation, but he was not about to comply without understanding the charges. "On what grounds?" Lucas asked, his voice steady. "What am I being arrested for?" "For obstructing a police investigation," Mulligan snapped, his eyes glinting with triumph. "Now turn around before we do this the hard way." Lucas felt a surge of anger, but he swallowed it down, knowing that a confrontation would only make things worse. He could see Baxter's discomfort growing, the young officer's uncertainty playing out in the way he fidgeted with his equipment. Lucas saw an opening, an opportunity to break the momentum of the situation. "Officer Baxter," Lucas said calmly, addressing the younger cop directly, "you know this isn't right. There's no investigation, and there's no crime here. You're making a mistake." Baxter's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by Lucas's direct appeal. For a moment he hesitated, glancing uncertainly at Mulligan, who glared at him with barely restrained fury. The rain was falling steadily now, a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked through Lucas's clothes and made the world feel smaller and more confined. "Do your job," Mulligan barked at Baxter, his voice a sharp command. "Cuff him." Lucas stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to make them see reason, had to get through to Baxter before the situation spiraled out of control. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, and he knew that the next few seconds would determine the outcome of the confrontation. "Officer, I am a federal agent," Lucas said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable authority. "If you arrest me without cause, you'll be facing serious repercussions. This is your chance to do the right thing." Baxter froze, his hand halfway to his handcuffs. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and his face was pale, caught between his loyalty to his partner and the growing realization that this situation was not what it seemed. The crowd murmured, their discontent growing louder, emboldened by Lucas's stand. Mulligan's expression darkened, and he took a step closer to Lucas, his face inches away, his breath hot and angry in the cool rain. "This is your last warning," he growled, his voice a barely controlled snarl. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Lucas felt a surge of adrenaline, but he forced himself to remain still, his gaze locked onto Mulligan's. He could sense the uncertainty in Baxter, the hesitation that might be the key to diffusing the situation. He had to take the risk, had to push just enough to break the officer's resolve without triggering a full-blown arrest. The rain beat down harder, a relentless drumbeat that echoed the tension thrumming through the air. The crowd edged closer, their phones held high, recording every second of the encounter. Lucas saw a few familiar faces among them, activists he had worked with before, people who knew the stakes as well as he did. He felt a swell of determination, a deep sense of responsibility to stand firm. "This is wrong," Lucas said quietly, his voice carrying over the sound of the rain. "You know it, and I know it. Walk away while you still can." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Baxter's hand dropped away from his belt, his face a mask of indecision. He glanced at the crowd, then at Lucas, and finally at Mulligan, who looked as if he might explode with rage. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, as if the entire park had frozen in time. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, Baxter stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. He looked at Mulligan, his expression resolute. "I'm not doing this," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "This isn't right." Mulligan's face contorted with fury, but Lucas saw the victory in Baxter's defiance, a small, crucial step toward de-escalation. He knew that the situation was far from resolved, but he had shifted the balance, cracked the wall of hostility that Mulligan had tried to erect between them. The rain continued to pour, washing away the tension as the confrontation teetered on the edge of resolution. Lucas didn't move, didn't speak. He simply waited, his gaze steady and unyielding, daring Mulligan to take the next step. It was a silent standoff, a battle of wills that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, with a curse muttered under his breath, Mulligan spun on his heel and stormed away, his fists clenched at his sides. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The tension from the confrontation did not die down with the rain. Instead, it only seemed to intensify as the incident drew more attention. By now, a sizable crowd had gathered, and the word was spreading quickly through the park. News of what was happening circulated from person to person, drawing people from all directions, those who had seen what transpired, and those curious to witness the unfolding drama. Voices began to rise above the sound of the falling rain, questioning the officers' motives and criticizing their aggressive behavior. Those who had gathered were no longer just passive observers. They became vocal, challenging Mulligan and Baxter's actions with shouts of, "Leave him alone," and "This isn't right." Some were emboldened to step forward, creating a protective barrier around Lucas, as if to shield him from any further threat. The tension crackled like static electricity, fed by the shared anger and frustration of the crowd, many of whom had faced similar encounters with law enforcement. Lucas remained still in the center of the circle, acutely aware of every movement and sound around him. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the silent demand for him to stand his ground, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under the same discriminatory scrutiny. Yet his thoughts remained divided, glancing every few seconds at his watch and then at the park's farthest edge, where the informant he was supposed to meet had yet to appear. Meanwhile, Ethan Holloway, a local investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption, had been passing through the park when he spotted the unfolding confrontation. His instincts kicked in immediately. This was more than just an ordinary stop and frisk. It was the kind of incident that could spark a deeper examination of the issues plaguing the city. Pulling out his phone, Ethan began recording, capturing the rising tension, the defiant faces in the crowd, and the steadfast expression on Lucas's face as he refused to back down. For the local Black community, the confrontation became a rallying point, a moment that symbolized years of simmering frustration finally boiling over. Older residents who remembered the struggles of previous decades stood shoulder to shoulder with younger activists who had taken up the mantle, all united in their anger and determination. People held up phones, some live streaming the incident to social media, while others shouted for justice, demanding an end to racial profiling and police harassment. Lucas had unknowingly become the center of a storm that had been brewing for years. The rain had shifted from a steady drizzle to a full downpour, but it did nothing to deter the gathering crowd. Parents arrived with children in tow, and students who had heard the commotion filtered in from nearby shops and cafes. Signs hastily scrawled on pieces of cardboard appeared above the sea of umbrellas, reading messages like, "End police bias," and "We stand with Lucas." The atmosphere was thick with anger, solidarity, and a hint of fear that the situation could spiral out of control at any moment. Ethan moved through the crowd, catching fragments of conversations, listening to testimonies from those who had witnessed the event. He was careful to remain in the background, observing without drawing attention to himself, knowing that his presence could alter the narrative he was trying to document. With every passing moment, he sensed that this was more than a single incident. It was the spark to ignite a larger, deeper conversation about systemic inequality. He knew he had to be there, not only as a witness, but as a voice to bring the truth to the surface. Meanwhile, Lucas could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, and it filled him with a sense of unease and responsibility. He did not want to be a symbol. He was just trying to protect his source and handle a difficult situation without violence. Yet he recognized that this moment had become bigger than him. He stood straighter, his posture unbroken despite the weight pressing down on his shoulders. He needed to remain calm, not only for himself, but for the people who were now depending on him to show courage. Mulligan, who had retreated a few steps after Baxter's defection, was now shouting to make himself heard over the roar of the crowd. His demands for the crowd to disperse went unheeded, and his frustration was evident in the way he gripped the handle of his baton, the whites of his knuckles showing. Baxter, still shaken, hung back, his gaze flickering nervously between Mulligan and the crowd that seemed to grow larger and angrier with every passing second. An older woman, wrapped in a bright yellow raincoat, stepped forward, her voice clear despite the noise. "We've seen this before," she shouted, pointing a finger directly at Mulligan. "We know what you're trying to do, and we won't stand for it." Her words were met with a chorus of agreement, a collective cry of defiance that seemed to rock the very ground beneath them. The crowd shifted closer, narrowing the space around Lucas and pushing Mulligan and Baxter further back. Ethan moved closer too, raising his phone to get a better angle, capturing the raw emotion of the moment as the tension seemed to swell to an unbearable degree. Lucas, sensing the danger of the moment, raised his hands in a placating gesture, his voice carrying over the din. "Please," he called out, addressing both the crowd and the officers, "let's not escalate this any further. We can resolve this peacefully." But it was too late. The momentum had shifted. The crowd, emboldened by the show of solidarity, was not willing to let this moment pass quietly. There were chants now, rhythmic and unyielding, echoing across the park. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" A call and response that grew louder and more insistent with each repetition. Mulligan looked as if he might break, his eyes wide with panic, his face flushed with the realization that he had lost control. From the edge of the crowd, a young man with a megaphone began to speak, his voice magnified above the chants. "This stops today," he declared, his words carrying the weight of collective frustration. "We're done with being treated like suspects in our own neighborhoods. We're done being targeted because of the color of our skin." Lucas's heart ached with the truth of those words. He had seen this anger before, in other cities and under different circumstances. He knew that it was justified, that it had been building for generations, and he also knew how dangerous it could be when that anger went unanswered. The faces in the crowd blurred through the rain, but their voices rang out clear and unwavering. As the chanting continued, a siren wailed in the distance, cutting through the noise like a knife. Ethan, sensing a shift, moved to the edge of the park, where flashing blue and red lights announced the arrival of more police units. It was clear that the situation was escalating, and Ethan knew that he had to move quickly if he wanted to document what would happen next. The new arrivals pushed their way through the crowd, their hands on their batons and their faces set in determined lines. They formed a loose line between Lucas and the onlookers, trying to reassert control, but the crowd refused to back down. There were more shouts, more accusations, and Lucas found himself at the center of a storm that threatened to tear the fragile peace apart. Baxter, who had been standing to the side, seemed paralyzed with indecision. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, and he was visibly shaking. Mulligan, seeing reinforcements arrive, straightened and regained some of his lost bravado, barking orders to disperse that went ignored. The sense of danger hung heavy in the air, as thick as the rain that now fell in sheets, soaking everyone to the bone. Lucas knew that he needed to act, to do something that would prevent the confrontation from turning violent. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, raising his voice to be heard over the chaos. "Listen to me," he shouted, his tone firm but pleading. "We don't need this to turn into something it shouldn't. We can make a difference without violence. We can be heard without fighting." The crowd hesitated, the chants dying down as they turned their attention back to him. For a moment, there was a fragile silence, a moment of stillness in which the outcome could go either way. Lucas's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of history and the promise of change. He looked into their eyes and saw the pain, the anger, the hope, the desire for justice that had brought them all together in the rain. Then one by one, the voices in the crowd began to soften, the tension easing as the weight of Lucas's calm presence settled over them like a blanket. They did not disperse, but they stepped back, giving space without losing their solidarity. It was a gesture of faith, a promise that they would not be silenced, but that they would listen to him. Mulligan's face twisted with frustration, but he seemed to sense that he had lost the crowd. He turned his back to Lucas, signaling to the newly arrived officers to stand down. There was a murmur of uncertainty among the ranks, but they obeyed, lowering their batons and stepping back, retreating slowly under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. Lucas exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. He knew that the danger was not over, that this was just the beginning of a long and painful journey. But for now, the storm had passed, leaving him standing in the middle of the park, surrounded by a community that had found its voice. As the rain slowed to a drizzle, Ethan approached him, his phone still recording. "This is only the start, isn't it?" he asked, his eyes bright with determination. "Yes," Lucas replied, his gaze shifting to the faces of those who had stood with him. "But we've taken the first step, and that's what matters." The crowd slowly began to disperse, but not before exchanging words of encouragement and solidarity with Lucas. They knew, just as he did, that this confrontation was only a small part of a much larger struggle, one that would require persistence, unity, and the strength to keep pushing forward. Ethan stayed close, sensing that the story was far from over, and Lucas, despite his exhaustion, felt a spark of hope amidst the uncertainty. The journey had only just begun, and the path ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. But in that moment, under the fading rain, Lucas knew they had ignited something powerful, something that would not be easily extinguished. The tension in the park had reached its breaking point. The crowd that had gathered was now larger than ever, a diverse group of onlookers, students, activists, elderly residents, and families, demanding answers from the local police officers who had initiated the confrontation. Derek Mulligan and Kyle Baxter, who had started the encounter with an air of authority and control, now appeared visibly unsettled, their eyes darting nervously from Lucas to the crowd and back again. The rain, once a gentle drizzle, had turned into a relentless downpour, soaking everyone to the bone and amplifying the sense of chaos and urgency in the air. Mulligan's face was flushed with frustration as he barked orders at Lucas to comply. "This is your last warning," he shouted, his voice strained, barely audible over the rising murmur of the crowd. "Hand over your ID, or we will arrest you for resisting a lawful order." Lucas, maintaining his calm, understood that this was no longer just about him. The crowd was no longer a passive audience. They were participants, witnesses to an unfolding narrative of injustice. He took a deep breath, the rain streaming down his face, and pulled out his phone. Without hesitation, he called his FBI supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Sheila Grant. He knew that the only way to de-escalate the situation was to bring in higher authority, someone who could speak to the officers and confirm his identity before things spiraled out of control. "Grant, it's Lucas," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm at the park near the city center. I'm being threatened with arrest by local officers. I need backup, now." The crowd's shouts grew louder as Lucas made the call, demanding justice, calling out the officers for what they perceived as blatant racial profiling. The anger was palpable, swelling like a wave that threatened to crash over the officers. Mulligan's grip on his baton tightened, his eyes reflecting a mix of anger and fear as the crowd inched closer. A tense few minutes passed, each second feeling like an eternity. Then in the distance, the unmistakable sound of sirens cut through the rain. Flashing lights illuminated the gray park, casting stark shadows against the trees as a tactical police unit rolled onto the scene. The crowd parted slightly, warily watching as uniformed officers emerged, wearing heavy gear and exuding an air of authority. They moved quickly, forming a line between Lucas and the onlookers, attempting to reassert control over the situation. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as he watched them approach. This was the critical moment, the tipping point that would determine whether the situation would end peacefully or erupt into chaos. Mulligan and Baxter seemed momentarily emboldened by the arrival of reinforcements, stepping forward with a renewed sense of purpose. "Get him down!" Mulligan shouted, raising his baton as if to emphasize his command. But before anyone could move, Lucas made a decision. He reached inside his jacket with slow, deliberate movements, ignoring the way Mulligan's eyes widened in anticipation. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, fearing the worst. From his pocket, Lucas withdrew his leather ID wallet, flipping it open to reveal his FBI badge. The Golden Eagle insignia gleamed under the harsh light of the police spotlights. "I am Special Agent Lucas Reyes with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he declared, his voice clear and strong despite the rain. "And I demand to know the justification for your actions." The park fell into stunned silence. The tactical officers, who had been moving into a defensive formation, hesitated, their expressions shifting from determination to confusion. Mulligan and Baxter froze, their faces pale as they realized the gravity of their mistake. The ripple of shock passed through the crowd, their indignation shifting into something more profound. A recognition that this confrontation had exposed a deeper, systemic issue. Lucas's calm but firm declaration had flipped the script, turning him from a potential suspect into an undeniable authority. The crowd's anger, instead of dissipating, grew sharper, focused now on the inherent injustice of the situation. They began to chant, their voices rising in unison, demanding accountability from the officers who had sparked this confrontation. "Shame, shame, shame," the crowd shouted, their voices echoing through the rain-soaked park. The leader of the tactical unit, Sergeant Karen Hayes, approached Lucas, her expression a mix of disbelief and embarrassment. She glanced at his badge, then back at the two officers who had caused the incident, understanding the precarious position they were in. She signaled her team to stand down, her eyes narrowing as she studied Mulligan and Baxter, who were now retreating slightly, their confidence shattered. "Agent Reyes," Sergeant Hayes began, her tone respectful yet strained. "We were not informed that an FBI agent would be in the area. There must have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Lucas's voice was cold, cutting through the noise like a blade. "These officers had no reason to detain me, yet they chose to escalate the situation without cause. This was no misunderstanding, it was an abuse of power." The crowd, galvanized by Lucas's words, erupted in cheers of support, their fists raised in solidarity. Cameras flashed as people recorded every word, every moment, determined to document what had become a public reckoning. Sergeant Hayes looked visibly uncomfortable, torn between her duty to her colleagues and the undeniable truth of what had transpired. She turned to Mulligan and Baxter, her voice stern. "We'll be conducting a thorough review of this incident. Both of you are to return to the precinct immediately." Mulligan opened his mouth to protest, but one look at the gathering storm in the crowd's eyes silenced him. Baxter, looking defeated, lowered his gaze to the ground, unable to meet Lucas's or the crowd's eyes. The two officers slowly retreated, their steps heavy, swallowed by the darkness beyond the park's edge. Lucas lowered his badge, his eyes never leaving the tactical officers as they moved back. He knew the danger had passed, but he also knew that the damage had been done. The incident would not end here. It would ripple outward, touching the lives of everyone who had witnessed it and beyond. As the tension eased, the crowd's chants faded into a low murmur, a sense of victory mingling with a deeper frustration. They had stood their ground and they had been heard, but the encounter had laid bare the ugly reality of prejudice that still lingered in the system. Ethan Holloway, who had captured everything on video, stepped forward to Lucas's side, his face a mix of admiration and determination. "That was brave," Ethan said quietly, his phone still recording. "But this is only the beginning, isn't it?" Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of what had just transpired settle on his shoulders. "Yes," he replied, his voice resolute. "This fight is far from over, but tonight we took a stand." Sergeant Hayes, who had remained silent as the officers departed, looked at Lucas with an expression that was part apology, part recognition. "Agent Reyes, if you would..." I'd like to accompany you to the precinct to file a formal report. This will not be swept under the rug. Lucas hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Agreed, he said. But I won't be alone. There are too many eyes on this now. Hayes gave a brief nod, understanding the implication. The world was watching, and there was no hiding what had taken place. She gestured to the tactical unit to clear the area, acknowledging that any further confrontation would only deepen the crisis. The crowd, sensing the resolution, began to disperse slowly, though not without exchanging words of encouragement and solidarity. Some approached Lucas, shaking his hand, thanking him for standing his ground, while others spoke to Ethan, sharing their own stories of similar encounters with law enforcement. The park, which had been a battleground only moments before, now felt like a gathering place of unity, a brief sanctuary amidst the storm. As Lucas and Sergeant Hayes moved toward the police vehicles, the rain slowed to a misty drizzle, leaving the air crisp and charged with possibility. Ethan followed closely, determined to cover every moment of what would undoubtedly be a pivotal story. He knew that the night's events would not be easily forgotten. They would serve as a catalyst for something larger, a movement that had been waiting for its moment to ignite. Lucas glanced back one last time at the park, at the faces of those who had stood with him in the rain, and felt a surge of determination. The fight had only just begun, but he was ready. He had faced the storm, and he had not backed down. With Ethan by his side and the weight of the community's support behind him, Lucas knew that whatever came next, he would not face it alone. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was prepared to walk it, step by determined step, until justice was not just a word, but a reality. As the police cars pulled away, their lights casting a final fading glow across the rain-drenched park, Lucas allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He had stood his ground, and now it was time to make sure that what happened in that park would lead to real change, a change that would echo far beyond the boundaries of that darkened city. The journey was far from over, and as the rain finally stopped, leaving the night silent and still, Lucas Reyes knew that he had been given a new mission, one that would require everything he had and more. The days following the confrontation in the park were a whirlwind of activity and tension. Lucas Reyes resolved to ensure that what had transpired would not be brushed aside, threw himself into the next phase, a thorough internal investigation into the local police department. With the backing of his superiors at the FBI, who understood the implications of what had occurred, Lucas knew this was his chance to shine a light on a corrupt system that many had long suspected, but few had dared to expose. The evidence was compelling. Ethan Holloway's video of the encounter had already gone viral, sparking outrage and support from communities nationwide. Within hours, the footage was featured on news channels, shared across social media platforms, and became a rallying cry for activists demanding accountability. The local police department found itself under a magnifying glass, with every decision they had made in recent years coming under scrutiny. Lucas's office at the FBI became a hub of activity, papers and reports piling up as he meticulously reviewed every detail. He spent long nights sifting through old case files, compiling complaints against the local police, and identifying patterns of misconduct. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the evidence became. What began as a single incident in a park was now unraveling into a complex web of systemic corruption, one that had roots stretching back decades. Ethan Holloway, refusing to let the story die, published a series of hard-hitting exposés. His reports revealed a culture of discrimination within the local police force that disproportionately targeted Black and minority communities. Each article was a bombshell, citing first-hand accounts from witnesses, former officers, and victims of abuse. Ethan's words were sharp and unapologetic, calling out the officers by name and highlighting the stories of those who had suffered in silence for too long. The public reaction was explosive. Marches and protests erupted, with citizens demanding justice not only for Lucas, but for all those who had faced similar discrimination. The streets filled with signs, chants echoing through the city, and a surge of solidarity that could not be ignored. The movement grew, transcending the boundaries of the local community and attracting national attention. This was no longer just about one FBI agent. It was about the very fabric of law enforcement and accountability in America. Meanwhile, Dr. Olivia Chang, a respected sociologist who had been observing the case from afar, decided to get involved. She had spent years studying racial discrimination, documenting its effects on communities, and advocating for systemic change. Seeing an opportunity to make a real difference, she contacted Lucas, offering her expertise. The two formed an unlikely alliance, an FBI agent and an academic, both driven by a shared goal of uncovering the truth. Olivia began interviewing witnesses who had been present at the park that fateful day. Her background in sociology allowed her to ask the right questions, uncovering not only what they had seen, but also how it had affected them. Her interviews painted a picture of a police force that wielded power not to protect, but to control, creating an atmosphere of fear and distrust among those it was sworn to serve. The data she collected became a crucial part of the investigation, providing the academic legitimacy that Lucas needed to back up his findings. One afternoon, Olivia invited Lucas to her office at the university. It was cluttered with books, papers, and years of research, evidence of her lifelong dedication to understanding and combating racial injustice. She handed him a thick file, her expression serious. "These are my preliminary findings," she said, her voice steady. "There's a pattern of systemic bias that goes far beyond what happened to you in that park." Lucas flipped through the pages, his expression growing grimmer with each new statistic and testimony. "This is exactly what we need," he said, his tone resolute. "We're going to make sure they can't ignore this." They worked together, merging Olivia's research with the evidence Lucas had gathered. Ethan's articles continued to fuel the fire, each new exposé digging deeper into the police department's history. They uncovered evidence of falsified reports, cases of excessive force that had been quietly settled out of court, and a disturbing trend of targeting minority neighborhoods for aggressive policing tactics. Lucas knew they were building a case that was impossible to dismiss. The pushback from the local police was fierce. Lucas received anonymous threats, ominous letters warning him to back off or face the consequences. Late-night phone calls, silent except for heavy breathing, became a regular occurrence. It was clear that there were those who had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried, but Lucas refused to be intimidated. He installed extra security measures at his home, warned his family to stay vigilant, and pressed on with the investigation. Olivia also faced her share of harassment. Her office was vandalized one night, windows shattered, papers scattered, and a message spray-painted on the wall that read, "Stay out of our business." It was a clear attempt to scare her into silence, but she remained undeterred, even more convinced of the importance of their work. Lucas visited her the next morning, helping her clean up the mess while offering his support. They were in this together now, and there was no turning back. The evidence they compiled became overwhelming, a tidal wave of proof that revealed the corruption within the local police department. With every interview, every document, every piece of video evidence, the picture became clearer. This was not the work of a few bad apples, but a systemic problem that required a complete overhaul. The city's Black community, long marginalized and silenced, found a platform in the investigation, sharing stories of abuse and discrimination that had never seen the light of day. The pressure mounted on the city's leadership as the story spread. Local officials, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, began to make cautious statements about the need for reform. The police chief held a press conference, promising a full internal review and disciplinary action if necessary, but his words rang hollow to those who had heard similar promises before. The city's mayor, facing growing demands for action, announced the formation of a civilian oversight committee to examine the police department's practices. Lucas, Olivia, and Ethan watched the press conference from a small cafe near the FBI office, their expressions a mixture of hope and skepticism. "It's a start," Olivia said, sipping her coffee, "but it's not enough. We need real accountability, not just promises." Ethan nodded, already planning his next article. "I'm not letting this go," he said firmly. "They're not getting away with another PR stunt." The Civilian Oversight Committee, composed of local leaders, activists, and legal experts, began its work under intense public scrutiny. They called on Lucas to testify, to share his experience in the park and the evidence he had gathered since. It was a daunting task, but he knew it was necessary. The hearing was televised, drawing a massive audience eager to see justice done. As Lucas took the stand, he felt the weight of every eye on him, those in the room and those watching from their homes. He spoke clearly, recounting the events of that rainy afternoon with unwavering honesty. He described the harassment, the escalation, and the moment he had revealed his badge, turning the tide of the confrontation. Then he presented the evidence, a damning compilation of documents, videos, and testimonies that painted a picture of a police department steeped in prejudice and corruption. The hearing lasted for hours, with the committee members asking pointed questions and demanding answers from those responsible. Lucas remained composed, refusing to let the pressure shake his resolve. Olivia's data and Ethan's articles were also presented as evidence, creating an undeniable case for reform. The local police officials, called to testify in response, struggled to defend their actions, their words often ringing hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence. In the days that followed, the city's streets were alive with protests and demonstrations. Citizens marched with signs bearing Lucas's name, chanting for justice, demanding accountability. The movement had grown beyond a single incident. It was now a cry for change, a rejection of the status quo. The pressure became too great to ignore, and soon resignations began to trickle in. Officers implicated in the investigation stepping down, city officials distancing themselves from the scandal. Lucas, Olivia, and Ethan continued their work, knowing that the hardest part was yet to come. They had succeeded in exposing the truth, but now they needed to ensure that the city followed through on its promises. Reform would not come easily, and the forces that had benefited from the old system would not give up without a fight. But they had momentum, and they had the support of a community that had finally found its voice. The chapter closed with a sense of cautious optimism. There was still so much work to be done, but they had taken the first, crucial step. The investigation had brought to light the hidden darkness within the local police force, and the city was now forced to confront the truth it had long ignored. For Lucas, it was a victory, but not a final one. Only a beginning in the long struggle for justice. As the dust settled, he knew that he and his allies had started something that could not be stopped, a movement that would continue to grow and push for change, one small victory at a time. The battle was far from over, but they were ready, and they would not back down. The impact of the investigation into the local police force was like a spark in dry tinder. It ignited a fire that rapidly spread through the city and beyond. The days following Lucas's testimony were marked by a palpable sense of urgency in the air. People who had once felt isolated and powerless now saw that change was not only possible, but necessary. The community, long simmering under the surface with stories of discrimination and injustice, was now emboldened to speak out, fueled by the promise of accountability. Demonstrations began spontaneously in neighborhoods throughout the city. The first march started in a predominantly Black neighborhood and wound its way to the front steps of City Hall. Protesters carried signs with messages like "Justice for all" and "End police corruption." Many of them chanted Lucas's name, recognizing him as the man who had stood his ground and forced the city to confront its own prejudice. The energy was electric. This was not a moment, but a movement, and it was gaining momentum with every passing day. Lucas, who had never sought the spotlight, found himself at the center of the storm. His face appeared on national news, his story shared and reshared on social media platforms. He received invitations to speak at community centers, churches, and schools, each appearance drawing larger crowds than the last. Though he was reluctant, he felt a sense of duty to stand before his community, to use his voice for those who had been silenced. His story became a rallying cry, a powerful testament to resilience in the face of injustice. The local Black community, galvanized by the exposure of systemic discrimination, began to organize on a scale that the city had never seen. Long-standing civil rights groups, grassroots organizations, and newly formed coalitions came together in a show of unity. Community leaders held meetings in church basements, union halls, and public parks, planning strategy and sharing resources. They coordinated marches, sit-ins, and peaceful protests, making sure their voices were heard not just in the city, but throughout the entire state. Workshops and educational forums became a staple in the community. These gatherings were aimed at empowering individuals with knowledge of their rights and teaching them how to safely and effectively engage in activism. Lucas, now a respected figure in the community, was often the keynote speaker. He shared his own experiences, not just as an FBI agent, but as a Black man who had faced discrimination, a man who understood the complexities of both the justice system and the injustices it perpetuated. During one particularly emotional forum held in a community center, Lucas shared the story of his upbringing, how his father had been a community leader who fought for civil rights in the 1960s, and how that legacy had shaped his own path to joining the FBI. He spoke about his struggles within the agency, about the moments he felt isolated because of the color of his skin, and about his commitment to reforming the very system he was a part of. His words resonated deeply, and he became not just a symbol of resistance, but a source of hope. But with the newfound visibility came danger. As the marches grew larger and the demands for reform became louder, Lucas began to receive threats. The anonymous letters became more frequent, each one more ominous than the last. There were moments when he wondered if he was putting his family at risk, if his public stance was worth the danger it brought. Yet every time he looked into the eyes of those who had suffered in silence for so long, he knew he could not back down. This was bigger than him. It was about creating a world where his children, and all children, would not have to face the same injustices he had. One evening, after a particularly large demonstration, Lucas returned home to find his front porch vandalized. Spray painted across the door was a slur, a message meant to intimidate him into silence. For a moment he stood there frozen, as the reality of what he was up against settled over him. Then with a steady hand, he picked up his phone and took a picture of the vandalism. The next day he posted the image on his social media account with a simple message: "I will not be silenced." The post went viral, sparking an outpouring of support that only strengthened his resolve. Amid the turmoil, Dr. Olivia Chung continued her work, speaking at academic forums and contributing research to the public discourse. Her data was critical, offering concrete evidence that backed up the stories being shared by community members. She hosted workshops on implicit bias, educating both law enforcement and the public on how to recognize and dismantle prejudiced thinking. These workshops were well attended, attracting a diverse crowd eager to be part of the solution. Ethan Holloway's role as an investigative journalist took on new importance. His articles continued to expose the deep-seated issues within the police force, and he began to interview members of the community, amplifying their stories in the local and national press. Each piece was a meticulous blend of hard facts and human interest, painting a vivid picture of the ongoing struggle for justice. He refused to shy away from the ugliness of what he uncovered, and his work became a powerful weapon in the fight for reform. The local government, feeling the mounting pressure from the community and the media, was forced to respond. The mayor, who had initially dismissed the protesters as troublemakers, suddenly found himself attending town hall meetings and issuing statements of solidarity. City council members, wary of losing their seats in the next election, began drafting proposals for police reform, including the establishment of an independent oversight board and increased funding for bias training. Lucas, Olivia, and Ethan were invited to participate in these discussions, representing the community's voice at the table. It was a victory, but Lucas remained cautious. He had seen political promises crumble before, and he was determined that this time would be different. The community was equally wary. They had heard the rhetoric of change before, only to be disappointed when the cameras left and the promises faded. The weeks turned into months, and the protests continued. What had started as a response to a single incident in a park had evolved into a citywide movement for justice and equality. The marches became more organized, the chants more unified. Volunteers canvassed neighborhoods, registering voters and encouraging civic participation. The movement took on a life of its own, driven by a powerful mix of anger, hope, and a collective yearning for a better future. Amidst this newfound activism, Lucas continued to share his story. He spoke at churches, schools, and community gatherings, always stressing that this movement was not about him, but about the people. He urged the community to hold their leaders accountable, to remain vigilant, and to never let the fire of change die out. Each time he took the stage, he felt the weight of the expectations on his shoulders, but he also felt the support of the people behind him, a community that had found its voice and was no longer afraid to use it. One rainy afternoon during a town hall meeting at a local school, a young woman stood up to ask a question. Her voice trembled as she spoke, recounting her own experience with police harassment. Lucas listened intently, his heart breaking at the pain in her words. When she finished, he stepped down from the podium and walked over to her, offering a hug. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything the movement was fighting for. A moment of recognition, of solidarity, of hope. The meeting ended with a standing ovation, and as Lucas left the building, he knew that they had crossed a threshold. The community was awake now, their eyes wide open to the reality of the system they lived under. There would be no going back to the way things were, no return to the days of silent suffering. They had found their strength in each other, and they would not stop until justice was truly served. As Chapter 6 drew to a close, it was clear that the struggle was far from over, but the city had been changed forever. Lucas, Olivia, and Ethan knew they were in the midst of something bigger than any of them, a transformation that could reshape not just their city, but the very nature of policing and justice in the country. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the road would be long, but they were no longer walking it alone. The community had risen, and together they would continue the fight, one step at a time, until change was more than just a word. It was a reality. This chapter was the dawn of a new era, a promise that the sacrifices made and the battles fought would not be in vain. The community had awakened, and with Lucas at the forefront, they would push forward, undeterred, determined to rewrite their future. As the weeks turned into months, Lucas found himself at the center of a growing storm. What had begun as a singular incident in the park now revealed a cascade of systemic issues. Years of racial profiling, cover-ups, and unchecked abuses of power within the local police department. The investigation's revelations had struck a nerve, not just in the city, but across the nation, igniting debates about law enforcement and accountability. Lucas knew that this was no longer about one case or even one police department. It was about challenging the very foundations of a system that had failed so many for so long. Each day brought new challenges and threats. The support Lucas received from his community and allies was matched by a fierce backlash from those who viewed his actions as a betrayal. Anonymous letters appeared in his mailbox, some bearing veiled threats, others containing outright death warnings. Graffiti on his car and hate messages posted on social media became a regular occurrence. Yet instead of retreating, Lucas felt his determination harden with each attempt to intimidate him. He knew that fear was the weapon of the oppressor, and he refused to let it control him. Lucas's work with Dr. Olivia Chang and Ethan Holloway intensified. They met regularly, often late into the night, in back rooms of local community centers, or in Ethan's cluttered office filled with stacks of notes and files. There they pored over records, pieced together stories from whistleblowers, and compared notes on witness accounts. The team had become a force of its own. Ethan's relentless investigative journalism, Olivia's academic expertise, and Lucas's understanding of the system from within created a trio that local authorities could no longer easily dismiss. The investigation expanded beyond the initial incident in the park, revealing a pattern of corruption that stretched far deeper than anyone had initially suspected. They discovered a long-standing practice of disproportionately targeting Black and minority neighborhoods, engaging in stop and frisk without reasonable cause, and using excessive force. Records that were thought to be sealed or lost began to surface, revealing a history of complaints against officers like Derek Mulligan and Kyle Baxter, complaints that had been routinely ignored or dismissed by the higher-ups in the police department. Public pressure was mounting. Every new revelation added fuel to the fire, and the marches that had begun as localized protests now swelled to include participants from neighboring towns and even other states. News stations from across the country dispatched reporters to cover the growing unrest, and the story of the small city became a national sensation. Lucas's face was plastered on television screens and magazine covers, his name a rallying cry for reform and a target for those who resented what they perceived as a dangerous shift in the status quo. Dr. Chang's role in the movement became more critical as her research brought legitimacy to the public outcry. She organized town hall meetings that were more than just emotional gatherings. They were informative sessions aimed at educating the public on the systemic nature of bias within law enforcement. She provided data and historical context, linking the local issues to a broader pattern of discrimination that existed across the country. Her calm, scholarly approach complemented the passion of the protesters, offering them a deeper understanding of the very system they sought to change. Meanwhile, Ethan Holloway's exposés gained nationwide attention. His articles painted a detailed and damning portrait of the local police department, complete with interviews from former officers who had left in disgust over the culture of silence and complicity. Holloway had even tracked down individuals who had moved away from the city, fleeing the harassment and intimidation they faced after speaking out against the police. Each article was another nail in the coffin of the department's credibility, and local officials found themselves in a defensive posture, scrambling to contain the damage. But it wasn't only the police force that was feeling the heat. City officials who had long been content to look the other way now found themselves under scrutiny. Old alliances between certain local politicians and law enforcement began to unravel as connections to funding, favors, and political favors were brought to light. Lucas, Olivia, and Ethan knew they had to strike while the iron was hot. They needed to push for concrete, long-term changes before the momentum waned and the system reverted to its old habits. The trio set their sights on the systemic reform, pushing for an independent oversight committee with the power to investigate police misconduct without interference from the department itself. They demanded mandatory body cameras for all officers, the establishment of de-escalation training programs, and the abolition of quotas that incentivized racial profiling. These demands were met with fierce resistance from within the police department and from the powerful police union, which fought to maintain its influence over local politics. The backlash became more vicious as Lucas and his allies continued their relentless campaign. Protesters who had become regular faces at demonstrations were suddenly targeted for minor infractions, their homes and vehicles tagged with threatening messages. Lucas's home was vandalized again. This time, the windows shattered and his car tires slashed. Late one night, a brick was thrown through his living room window, landing on the floor with a crude message: "Back off or pay the price." He knew he was being watched and the danger was real. Lucas's FBI colleagues offered increased security, but he declined. He refused to let intimidation tactics dictate his life, and he wasn't going to be scared into hiding. Instead, he doubled down, appearing at rallies with Olivia and Ethan by his side, and speaking out against the threats, proof that their work was necessary. His bravery inspired others, and the crowds only grew larger, the chants for justice only louder. One key moment in the struggle came when a whistleblower from within the police department reached out to Lucas. This officer, a veteran with over 2 decades of service, provided damning internal documents, memos that revealed a policy of targeted enforcement in predominantly Black neighborhoods, instructions to prioritize traffic stops in minority communities, and lists of names deemed suspicious without cause. These revelations were a bombshell, proving what the community had long suspected and turning the tide in the court of public opinion. The leaked documents made headlines across the country, and the city's mayor called for a special committee to investigate the police department's practices. Lucas, Olivia, and Ethan were invited to testify before the committee. It was a moment of vindication, but Lucas knew that this was only the beginning. He sat before the panel of city officials and delivered a testimony that was equal parts factual and emotional, recounting not just the events in the park, but the broader consequences of systemic discrimination. His words were broadcast live, reaching millions of viewers who watched as he laid bare the injustices he had witnessed. The city was at a boiling point, with public trust in its institutions shattered. The police chief, facing calls for his resignation, attempted to spin the narrative, claiming that a few bad apples were to blame and that the department was committed to reform. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the public was no longer willing to accept half-hearted promises of change. They wanted accountability, real, tangible consequences for those who had abused their power. Ethan Holloway's articles on the leaked documents were read by millions, shared on social media with hashtags that demanded justice. His reporting became a flashpoint in the conversation about police reform, and his interviews with local citizens who had suffered under discriminatory policing practices, humanized the data that Dr. Chang presented. The movement was now a force that could not be ignored, and the momentum felt unstoppable. The relentless battle was taking its toll on Lucas, who found himself exhausted and worn from the constant pressure. The emotional weight of leading a movement, of being the public face of a demand for justice, sometimes felt like too much to bear. He sought solace in moments of quiet, sitting in his backyard under the night sky, reflecting on how far they had come and how much further they had to go. It was during these moments that he remembered why he had started this fight in the first place. Because the cost of doing nothing was too high, and because every story that came to light was a reminder that this was not about him, but about everyone who had suffered in silence for too long. One evening, after yet another town hall meeting that saw heated exchanges between activists and police union representatives, Lucas received a call from the whistleblower. The officer, whose identity was still hidden to protect his safety, thanked Lucas for giving him the courage to come forward. His voice was shaky but determined as he said, "This is the beginning of the end for them. Keep pushing." Lucas hung up the phone, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the battle was far from over, and that there would be more fights to come, both in the courts and in the hearts and minds of those still resistant to change. But he also knew that they had reached a turning point. The foundation of the old order was cracking, and a new vision for justice was beginning to emerge. As Chapter 7 closed, the movement for change was now a roaring river, powerful and unstoppable. Lucas, Olivia, and Ethan stood at the forefront, leading the charge with the knowledge that they had struck a blow against the forces of oppression. The road ahead was uncertain, but they were ready to face it together, determined to turn their relentless battle into a lasting victory. As the investigation reached its zenith, anticipation swirled through the city. Public trials and hearings became the focus of national attention, with news cameras stationed outside courtrooms, live streams broadcasting every significant moment, and social media buzzing with updates. It was a defining chapter in a story that had evolved from a single tense confrontation in a rainy park to a national reckoning on the abuses of power within law enforcement. The trial of officers Mulligan and Baxter became the centerpiece, a symbol of a system that had long evaded accountability. Crowds gathered daily outside the courthouse, their signs and chants a potent reminder of the public's demand for justice. Inside, the prosecution built its case meticulously, drawing on the overwhelming evidence Lucas and his allies had unearthed. Videos of the initial confrontation, internal documents leaked by the whistleblower, and testimony after testimony from members of the local community who had experienced harassment, discrimination, and brutality. Lucas sat quietly in the back of the courtroom on the first day of the trial, his presence a stark reminder to the defense of the stakes involved. Mulligan and Baxter's defense attorneys did their best to paint the incident as a misunderstanding, a result of standard procedure blown out of proportion by a public eager for a scapegoat. They argued that the officers had been doing their jobs and that the reaction of the crowd had escalated the situation far beyond what it needed to be. Yet the facts told a different story, one of consistent abuse, racial profiling, and a culture of impunity fostered by the local police department for years. Ethan Holloway's articles, now submitted as part of the official record, served as a chronological history of the corruption that had festered within the department. His pieces were quoted by prosecutors as they made their opening statements, illustrating a pattern of discriminatory behavior that could no longer be denied or ignored. Each day, new testimonies deepened the case. Former officers who had left in disillusionment spoke about their colleagues' contempt for minority communities. Civilians shared experiences of unwarranted traffic stops, aggressive searches, and intimidation. The star witness, however, was the whistleblower. His identity revealed for the first time as Detective Marcus Hill, a man with 25 years of service who could no longer turn a blind eye to the injustices he had witnessed. His testimony was devastating. He described internal meetings where supervisors explicitly encouraged officers to target minority neighborhoods, using racial slurs to justify their actions, and making it clear that promotions were contingent on adhering to the unspoken rules. Hill spoke with a mixture of anger and sorrow, recounting the moment he realized that he could no longer be part of an organization that valued loyalty to the blue line over loyalty to justice. Dr. Olivia Chang also took the stand, bringing a wealth of data that demonstrated the broader trends of racial bias within the department. Her research showed that over the past decade, stops and arrests in predominantly Black neighborhoods were disproportionately higher than in other areas, despite crime rates being similar. Her testimony was cold, clinical, and damning, showing in stark numbers what the victims' stories had already made painfully clear. She was not there to tell emotional stories. She was there to provide undeniable proof. The defense's cross-examination was fierce, attempting to discredit the witnesses, suggesting bias and ulterior motives. They implied that Marcus Hill was seeking revenge after a career setback, that Dr. Chang's statistics were selective, and that Ethan's journalism was tainted by his sympathy for the protesters. But every attempt to discredit was met with a calm and firm rebuttal, and each defense misstep only solidified the perception that they were grasping at straws. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Mulligan and Baxter were not isolated cases. The court heard how the local law enforcement culture had systematically shielded officers from accountability, covering up complaints with empty internal investigations, and routinely dismissing civilian grievances as unfounded. The trial uncovered hidden connections between certain city officials and the police department, favoritism, political contributions, and under-the-table deals to ensure that oversight remained a toothless threat. This was no longer just about the actions of two officers. It was about dismantling a system that had been broken for far too long. For Lucas, attending the daily hearings was both cathartic and deeply unsettling. He listened as witness after witness described experiences that mirrored his own confrontation, their voices breaking as they recounted moments of humiliation and fear. Yet amidst the testimonies of pain, there was a growing sense of solidarity, a recognition that by coming forward, they were no longer isolated victims, but part of a larger, powerful movement for change. Outside the courtroom, the demonstrations grew. Community leaders organized sit-ins, rallies, and press conferences to maintain public pressure. Lucas became a regular speaker at these events, his speeches a rallying cry for justice. He reminded the crowds that the trial, though significant, was not the endpoint but a beginning, a chance to set a precedent, to show that even the most entrenched systems could be held accountable. The verdict, when it finally came, was a historic moment. Mulligan and Baxter were found guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and falsifying reports to cover up their discriminatory practices. The judge, in her closing statement, condemned not only the actions of the officers, but also the culture of silence that had allowed such behavior to flourish. The sentence was severe, intended not just as punishment, but as a message that the days of unchecked authority were coming to an end. But for Lucas, the most significant victory lay not in the courtroom, but in the broader shifts that were beginning to take place. The conviction of Mulligan and Baxter triggered a wave of internal investigations across the country, as cities began to look at their own practices with a newfound sense of urgency. Police departments, fearing similar scandals, initiated reforms, from increased transparency in handling complaints to revising training programs to emphasize de-escalation and racial bias awareness. Dr. Chang's research was cited in debates at the national level, her findings influencing the creation of independent oversight boards that would monitor police behavior without the interference of the departments themselves. Olivia's work was no longer confined to academic journals. It was now part of the legislative process, shaping policy and reform at the highest levels. Meanwhile, Ethan's articles, which had started as local exposés, became a journalistic triumph. He was awarded a series of prestigious honors, his name becoming synonymous with investigative integrity. The newspaper that employed him saw a surge in readership, and Ethan used his newfound platform to continue advocating for systemic change. His work inspired a new generation of journalists to dig deeper, to hold power to account, and to report stories that needed to be told, no matter the consequences. Despite the public success, Lucas knew that they had only won a single battle in a much larger war. For every victory in the courtroom or the legislative chambers, there were still communities suffering from the effects of systemic racism. There were still people who saw the events as an overreaction, who believed that the status quo had been justifiable and that Lucas and his allies were radicals intent on upending tradition. These voices, though quieter now, had not disappeared, and Lucas understood that complacency was the enemy of progress. He continued to work with local and national groups, participating in panels, attending conferences, and speaking to young activists about the importance of vigilance. The city, still scarred from the trial, began to heal. New leadership was elected, old policies were dismantled, and a fresh wave of officers trained under the new guidelines joined the force. The park where Lucas's fateful encounter had taken place was no longer a symbol of fear, but of change. A place where the community gathered for open forums, movie nights, and vigils for those who had suffered. The battle had been long and exhausting, but as Lucas looked around at the shifting landscape, he felt a cautious optimism. The final exposure of the corruption within the local law enforcement was not an end, but a catalyst for a broader awakening. It was a reminder that change was possible, but only if the fight continued, only if people remained vigilant, outspoken, and united. As the chapter closed, Lucas made a quiet promise to himself and to the community that had supported him, that he would not let the momentum fade, that he would continue to fight for the future generations who deserved a system that served justice, not power. It was a promise that echoed through the streets of the city, now filled with a sense of renewal and a belief that the power to create a better world rested in their hands. After the trials, the nation's attention remained firmly fixed on Lucas Reyes. No longer just an FBI agent who had stumbled into an incident of police misconduct, Lucas had transformed into a leading figure of a movement much larger than himself. His quiet determination, his commitment to transparency, and his insistence on accountability had turned him into a powerful voice for justice. News outlets called him the reluctant activist, a man who, by chance and choice, became the face of a grassroots struggle to reform the system. With his story making headlines, invitations began pouring in from across the country. Lucas found himself in cities he had never imagined visiting, standing before crowds of students in packed university lecture halls, facing the press at national conferences, and speaking to small gatherings in local community centers. He shared his story, the dangers of unchecked authority, the impact of systemic racism, and the resilience required to challenge deeply ingrained power structures. His speeches were never about him. They were about the countless others who had been silenced, about the hidden stories that were yet to be told, and about the urgent need for change. The movement had become a fire that refused to be extinguished. Social media amplified every word he spoke, turning his experiences into rallying cries that resonated with both the young and old, with activists and the disillusioned, with those who had suffered silently for too long. His speeches were punctuated by applause and shouts of affirmation, a clear sign that his message had struck a chord with a country grappling with its identity. Lucas often ended his talks with a call to action, urging his audience not to be complacent, to hold power accountable, and to remember that change, though slow, was inevitable if people remained vigilant. But Lucas's newfound prominence was not without its risks. A few weeks after the trial, an anonymous letter arrived at his doorstep. It was terse, typed in capital letters. "You're making too much noise. Back down or face the consequences." It was not the first threat he had received, but it was the most direct. His initial reaction was one of dread, a flash of panic at the thought of danger encroaching upon his personal life. Yet this time, the fear didn't linger. Instead, it ignited a determination that had been tempered in the fire of public scrutiny. He knew that stepping back now would mean conceding to the very forces he had fought against. Surrounded by supporters and allies who had stood by him throughout the turbulent investigation, Lucas found strength. The threats were a reminder that his work was making an impact, that the right people, or perhaps the wrong people, were paying attention. Ethan Holloway, who had become not only a professional ally but a close friend, urged him to continue, offering his investigative skills to track the origins of the threats. Dr. Olivia Chang, too, was there, providing academic insight into the societal backlash against whistleblowers and advocates for change. Together, they formed a network of trust, a support system that allowed Lucas to press forward without hesitation. Meanwhile, the movement itself continued to evolve. Lucas's story became a case study in colleges and universities, where professors used it to illustrate the dynamics of systemic bias and the role of activism in modern society. Documentaries were made, featuring interviews with those who had witnessed the events firsthand and experts who discussed the broader implications. The park where Lucas's initial confrontation had occurred became a symbolic space, a meeting ground for local activists, a place where people gathered to remember and to organize. It was clear that his story was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who saw themselves in his struggle, everyone who had faced similar injustices, and everyone who believed in the possibility of a fairer world. Lucas found himself increasingly in demand. City officials invited him to consult on new policies aimed at increasing police accountability and community oversight. He participated in panels with lawmakers, experts, and other advocates to draft legislation that would mandate body cameras, independent investigations into police misconduct, and the restructuring of internal review processes to ensure true accountability. His involvement was both exhausting and energizing, a relentless schedule of meetings, speeches, and consultations that left little time for personal reflection. Yet he saw the tangible results of his work as city after city implemented reforms, some small, some sweeping, inspired by the changes he and his allies had fought so hard to achieve. Despite the positive momentum, there were setbacks. Not every city was willing to embrace the reforms. Some law enforcement agencies resisted, branding the movement as anti-police and a threat to public safety. Conservative media outlets criticized Lucas, calling him a troublemaker, accusing him of undermining trust in law enforcement. There were protests against the protests, counter-movements that sought to preserve the old ways, defending the officers who had been convicted as victims of a media witch hunt. Yet for every detractor, there were supporters, people who sent letters of encouragement, who shared their own stories of injustice, and who expressed their gratitude for his courage. Amidst the public engagements, Lucas made time for the communities that had been most affected by police misconduct. He spent hours with families who had lost loved ones, listening to their stories and absorbing their pain. He visited schools in underprivileged neighborhoods, speaking to young students about their rights, about the importance of education, and about the need to pursue truth even when it was uncomfortable. He became a mentor to a new generation of activists, offering guidance on how to navigate the complexities of advocacy while remaining true to the cause. His travels eventually led him back to the small town where everything had begun. It had been almost a year since the initial confrontation in the park, and the town had changed in visible ways. The old police leadership had been replaced, new policies were in place, and there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. The park itself had been transformed. What was once a symbol of injustice had become a community gathering space. A mural had been painted, depicting Lucas and the crowd that had supported him, with the words "Justice begins with us" emblazoned across the top. It was a humbling moment for Lucas, who stood before the mural with a deep sense of gratitude for everyone who had stood by him and everyone who had found strength in his story. But even in this moment of reflection, a reminder of the challenges ahead was never far away. Another anonymous letter found its way into his mailbox, this time more threatening than the last. It was a stark reminder that the path to justice was fraught with danger and that there were still those who saw his advocacy as a threat to their way of life. He met with his security team, increased precautions, and ensured that his family and friends were protected. But he refused to let the threats define his actions or deter his mission. In the face of ongoing challenges, Lucas's speeches took on a more nuanced tone. He spoke about the complexity of justice, about the need for dialogue between communities and law enforcement, and about the importance of accountability not as a means of punishment, but as a way to rebuild trust. He emphasized that his fight was not against individual officers, but against a culture that allowed bias and corruption to thrive unchecked. It was a message of reconciliation, of forging a path forward that included everyone willing to work for a fairer system. The end of his national tour found him back at the park for a community vigil organized by local leaders. The atmosphere was hopeful but solemn, with hundreds of people gathered to light candles and listen to stories of those who had been affected by injustice. Lucas spoke last, his voice carrying over the crowd with a quiet strength. He acknowledged the difficulties ahead, the possibility of setbacks, and the knowledge that real change would take years, perhaps decades to fully realize. But he also spoke of hope, the hope that had brought them all together, the hope that would continue to drive them forward. As the vigil ended and the crowd began to disperse, a young girl approached Lucas, holding a small hand-drawn picture of him speaking to a crowd. She was no more than 12 years old, her eyes bright with admiration. She handed him the drawing with a shy smile, and Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat as he accepted it. It was a simple gesture, but it was a reminder of why he had started this journey and why he could never turn back. As the chapter closed, Lucas stood in the park, surrounded by the people he had fought for and with, the faces of a community that had transformed itself from one scarred by division to one united in its quest for justice. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was one he was ready to walk, knowing that he was no longer alone, and that the movement he had become a part of was stronger than any one person, any single setback, or any anonymous threat. It was a movement that would continue, driven by the unshakable belief that justice was not just an ideal, but a right, and that they would not rest until it was achieved for all.